December 22nd, 1944, 0830 hours, Bastogne, Belgium. Generalmajor Fritz Bayerlein stood in the command post of the Panzer Lehr Division and stared at the intelligence report that had just arrived from a reconnaissance patrol. His hands weren't shaking from cold, though the room was freezing. They were shaking because the numbers on the paper in front of him represented something he'd suspected but hoped wasn't true. The Americans were burning fuel to stay warm. Not burning a little fuel, burning thousands of gallons. The patrol had observed American positions around Bastogne and reported that American soldiers had fires going constantly, vehicle engines idling 24 hours a day for heat, tents heated with fuel-burning stoves, vehicles running just to keep batteries charged and engines warm. The Americans were consuming fuel for comfort, while Bayerlein's Panzer Division was rationing fuel so carefully that tanks sat immobile because moving them 10 kilometers might leave them stranded without fuel to retreat. Bayerlein did quick mental arithmetic. His entire division, one of Germany's premier armored formations, had been allocated 150,000 liters of fuel for the entire Ardennes offensive. That had to cover all movement, all combat operations, everything for 2 weeks. The Americans, according to his reconnaissance patrol, were burning approximately 200,000 liters per day just in the Bastogne sector, just for heat and convenience, not for combat, not for movement, for comfort. In one day, for non-essential purposes, the Americans were using more fuel than his entire division had for the most important German offensive of the war. He set down the report and looked at his staff officers. "Gentlemen, we've already lost this war." Several officers started to protest, but Bayerlein held up his hand. "No, listen to me. The Americans are burning more fuel to keep warm than we have to fight with. Think about what that means. They have so much fuel that they can waste it. We have so little fuel that we cannot move our tanks. This is not a temporary situation. This is permanent. This is the reality of fighting the United States of America. They have more of everything, and when you have more of everything, you win. It's just mathematics." This is the story of the moment a German general realized that tactical brilliance, superior equipment, and elite training meant nothing against an enemy with unlimited resources. The story of how American abundance, often criticized as waste, became the weapon that broke the German army. Not through superior fighting, not through better tactics, but through having so much fuel, so much food, so much ammunition, so many vehicles, so much of everything that German forces couldn't compete. This is the story of how logistics won World War II and how one German general watched it happen in real time. Fritz Bayerlein was not a typical German general. He'd served as Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa. He'd commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, Germany's elite demonstration armored unit, since January 1944. He was a practical soldier who understood logistics as well as tactics. He knew that armies ran on fuel and ammunition and food, not on courage and determination. And by December 1944, he knew that Germany's logistics situation was catastrophic, while Americans' logistics situation was almost obscenely abundant. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble in the West, had been planned partly around fuel calculations. German planners knew they lacked fuel to sustain extended operations. The plan assumed German forces would capture American fuel dumps during the advance. This wasn't a backup plan. This was the primary plan. The offensive was designed to run on captured American fuel. Think about that. Germany's most important strategic operation in 1944 was designed to succeed only if they stole fuel from the enemy. That's not a military operation. That's armed robbery masquerading as strategy. Bayerlein had objected to this planning assumption. What if they destroy the fuel dumps before we capture them? What if they defend them too well? What if we don't advance fast enough? The response from higher headquarters was dismissive. The Americans always leave supplies behind when they retreat. They're wasteful. They won't destroy their own supplies. We'll capture more than enough fuel to continue operations. This assumption that American waste would fuel German offensive operations revealed how completely German leadership misunderstood what they were fighting. The Americans weren't wasteful because they were careless. They were wasteful because they could afford to be. American logistics delivered so much fuel to forward units that local commanders never worried about running short. They could burn fuel for heat, for convenience, for any purpose, because tomorrow more fuel would arrive. This abundance created an operational freedom that German forces couldn't match. American commanders never calculated whether they had enough fuel. They just used fuel and knew more was coming. The contrast with German fuel situation was stark. Panzer Lehr Division had started the Ardennes offensive with enough fuel for approximately 100 kilometers of road march. In combat, consumption was higher. In difficult terrain, like the Ardennes, consumption was much higher. This meant Bayerlein's division could advance maybe 60 kilometers before needing resupply. The objective, Antwerp, was 160 kilometers away. The division couldn't reach the objective on available fuel even if they encountered zero resistance. The entire operation was predicated on capturing fuel from Americans. There was no Plan B. On the first day of the offensive, December 16th, Panzer Lehr Division had advanced approximately 8 kilometers. Good progress through difficult terrain against determined resistance. But 8 kilometers consumed nearly 1/5 of available fuel. At that rate, the division would be immobile within 5 days. They needed to capture American fuel immediately. The problem was that Americans, despite German assumptions, were destroying fuel dumps rather than allowing them to be captured. German intelligence about American carelessness was wrong. Americans understood that fuel was power. They weren't leaving it for Germans to take. By December 18th, Panzer Lehr Division was down to 40,000 liters, less than 1/3 of starting allocation. They'd advanced 25 kilometers. The division was consuming fuel faster than planned because combat operations in winter conditions burned fuel at incredible rates. Tanks idling to keep engines warm used 10 liters per hour per tank. The division had approximately 60 operational tanks. That meant 600 liters per hour just to keep tanks ready for immediate action. In 24 hours, just idling consumed 14,400 liters. In 3 days, the division burned its entire fuel allocation just keeping tanks warm without moving anywhere. Meanwhile, American forces around Bastogne were not just keeping tanks warm, they were running vehicles continuously, heating tents, powering generators, operating in ways that seemed insane to German fuel-starved observers. The 101st Airborne Division surrounded at Bastogne had initially been cut off from supply. By December 19th, supply situation was critical. Then American transport aircraft began dropping supplies. The first day, 144 tons. The second day, 160 tons. By December 23rd, when the weather cleared, 11,000 tons over following days. This included fuel, thousands of gallons of fuel delivered by air to a surrounded garrison. Bayerlein's reconnaissance patrols reported watching fuel drums parachute into Bastogne. This was incomprehensible. The Americans were flying fuel to surrounded troops. Fuel was heavy, bulky, and dangerous to transport. Flying it in transport aircraft seemed insane. Each C-47 aircraft carrying fuel carried maybe 5,000 pounds, equivalent to approximately 750 gallons. That's enough to run maybe 10 tanks for a day of combat. The transport cost, the risk to aircraft and crew, the inefficiency of air transport for bulk fuel all suggested this shouldn't be feasible. Yet the Americans were doing it, routinely, repeatedly, successfully. This revealed the scale of American logistics.
They could afford to fly fuel because they had so many transport aircraft that using them for emergency resupply didn't strain the system. They had so much fuel in the theater that diverting thousands of gallons for air transport didn't impact other operations. They had such robust logistics that what seemed impossible to Germans was merely inefficient to Americans. And they could afford inefficiency because they had such overwhelming resources that efficiency wasn't critical. The German perspective on American waste was shaped by scarcity. When you have 150,000 liters of fuel for an entire division for 2 weeks, every liter matters. You calculate fuel consumption down to the liter. You turn off engines whenever possible. You limit idling. You route movements to minimize fuel consumption. Fuel becomes more precious than ammunition because without fuel you can't move to
Positions where ammunition matters. German tankers learned to coast down hills to save fuel, to avoid unnecessary acceleration, to plan every movement to minimize consumption. This wasn't efficiency for its own sake. This was survival. American tankers learned different lessons. They learned to keep engines running because starting cold engines in winter was difficult and damaged engines. They learned to idle vehicles to keep batteries charged because dead batteries meant non-operational vehicles. They learned to run heaters because cold soldiers fought poorly. They learned that using fuel freely was better than conserving fuel and suffering operational penalties. This wasn't wastefulness. This was recognizing that fuel was a tool to maintain combat effectiveness, and American logistics ensured fuel was always available to use as needed. The psychological impact of this disparity on German soldiers was severe. They were cold, hungry, and immobile due to fuel shortages. Across the battlefield were Americans who were warm, well-fed, and mobile because they had unlimited fuel. German soldiers could hear American vehicles running constantly. They could see American campfires burning all night. They knew Americans weren't suffering from cold or hunger. This knowledge was demoralizing. You're fighting an enemy who is comfortable while you're miserable, who has plenty while you have nothing, who can waste more than you have. That's not a fair fight. That's not even a fight. That's slow-motion defeat.
By December 22nd, when Bayerlein received the report about American fuel consumption, Panzer Lehr Division was effectively immobile. They had approximately 15,000 liters of fuel remaining, enough to move tanks maybe 15 kilometers under ideal conditions. In combat or difficult terrain, maybe 8 kilometers. The division couldn't attack, couldn't retreat, could only sit in position and hope fuel arrived. No fuel was coming. German fuel supplies were exhausted. The offensive had consumed everything allocated, and there were no reserves. The entire German position in the Ardennes was now dependent on fuel situation that was unsustainable. American fuel situation was the opposite. By December 22nd, American forces in the European theater had fuel reserves exceeding 500 million gallons. That's not a typo. 500 million gallons. This reserve represented more fuel than German armed forces had consumed in the entire year of 1944. American logistics could sustain current operations for 6 months without a single additional shipment from the United States. This reserve wasn't an accident. This was American logistics operating normally. They built reserves because they could. They maintained stockpiles because logistics capacity allowed it. They had so much fuel that running short was nearly impossible. The source of this fuel abundance was American production and logistics. American oil production in 1944 exceeded 1.6 billion barrels. That's approximately 70 billion gallons. German oil production, including synthetic fuel, was approximately 23 million barrels, about 1 billion gallons. America produced 70 times more oil than Germany. This ratio made fuel competition absurd. Germany couldn't conserve enough or capture enough to close that gap. America produced more oil in 1 month than Germany produced in an entire year. But production was only part of American advantage. transportation was equally important. American logistics moved fuel from production to consumption efficiently. Pipelines from oil fields to refineries, tanker trucks from refineries to ports, tanker ships from ports to Europe, pipelines from European ports to forward depots, tank trucks from depots to units. The entire system moved millions of gallons daily with minimal loss. German logistics couldn't match this. German oil fields in Romania were under Soviet threat. German synthetic fuel plants were being bombed. German transportation network was being destroyed. Even fuel Germany produced often couldn't reach units that needed it. The Breckball Express demonstrated American logistics at its most impressive. This truck convoy system moved 12,500 tons of supplies daily from Normandy beaches to forward units. Peak operations used 6,000 trucks driving continuously. These trucks consumed approximately 300,000 gallons of fuel daily just operating. The system used more fuel than many armies had available for all purposes. Yet this massive fuel consumption supported operations that kept American armies advancing. The fuel burned by logistics trucks was investment that paid returns in maintained operational tempo. Germans saw waste, Americans saw effective logistics. Similar patterns appeared everywhere in American logistics. American field kitchens used fuel to heat water for showers. German soldiers hadn't seen hot showers in months. American medical units used heated surgical tents. German medical units operated in cold bunkers. American supply units had heated warehouses. German supply units stored materials in open air. The pervasive use of fuel for activities unrelated to direct combat created comfort and efficiency that German forces lacked. This wasn't luxury. This was maintaining human effectiveness through resource application. The American soldier experience versus German soldier experience revealed the impact of logistics. American soldiers received hot meals daily. German soldiers ate cold rations when available. American soldiers slept in heated tents. German soldiers slept in foxholes. American soldiers had regular mail from home. German soldiers had irregular mail subject to disruption. American soldiers received replacement equipment quickly. German soldiers wore worn equipment until it failed. American soldiers knew they were backed by overwhelming logistics. German soldiers knew they were on their own. This knowledge affected morale, combat effectiveness, and will to fight. Bayerlein understood that superior American logistics wasn't just about having more fuel, it was about system efficiency. American logistics worked because every level had clarity about what was needed, what was available, and how to move it. Requests for supplies went through channels that responded quickly. Delivery systems were robust with multiple redundancies. Units maintained reserves that prevented shortages. The system was designed for abundance rather than scarcity. German logistics was designed for efficiency under scarcity. American logistics was designed for overwhelming availability. In war, overwhelming availability beats efficiency under scarcity. The breaking point came on December 23rd when weather cleared and American air power returned to the battlefield. Bayerlein watched as waves of American aircraft struck German positions. P-47 Thunderbolts attacked with bombs and machine guns. Medium bombers hit rear areas. Transport aircraft dropped supplies to surrounded American units. The air operations were continuous from dawn to dusk. Bayerlein estimated he saw 500 aircraft in one day. His entire division had seen perhaps 5 German aircraft in the entire offensive. The 100-to-1 ratio in air power reflected the underlying logistics ratio. Americans could fly because they had fuel for aircraft. Germans couldn't fly because aircraft sat grounded for lack of fuel. That evening, Bayerlein called his staff together and gave an assessment that was brutally honest. Gentlemen, this offensive has failed. We lack fuel to continue. We lack fuel to hold position against American counterattacks. We lack fuel to retreat effectively. Our options are surrender or destruction in place. The Americans have unlimited fuel, unlimited ammunition, unlimited supplies. They are currently burning more fuel for comfort than we have for combat. This situation will not improve. Germany cannot outproduce America. Germany cannot outsupply America. Germany cannot defeat America through logistics, and modern war is logistics. Therefore, Germany cannot defeat America.
Everything else is details. His officers sat in silence. What Bayerlein was saying was obvious to anyone who looked at the numbers objectively, but saying it out loud was shocking. This was admission of defeat. Not just tactical defeat in the Ardennes, strategic defeat in the war. Final defeat because logistics guaranteed it. One officer asked what they should do. Bayerlein's response was pragmatic. We conserve fuel. We hold position as long as possible. We retreat when necessary. We fight when required. But we don't pretend we're going to win. We're just delaying inevitable defeat. The war is over. We lost. We're just living through the aftermath. The American counterattack began December 26th. Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne, ending the siege. American forces had fuel, ammunition, and supplies to sustain offensive operations indefinitely. German forces had exhausted offensive capability and were struggling to maintain defensive positions. The fuel disparity meant Americans could move and concentrate forces while Germans could only react locally. Operational mobility belonged entirely to Americans. Germans were reduced to static defense, the worst possible position for armored forces designed for mobile warfare. By January 1945, Panzer Lehr Division was withdrawn from the Ardennes, having lost most of its combat power. The division had achieved some tactical successes, but strategic failure was complete. The offensive that was supposed to split Allied armies and recapture Antwerp had advanced maybe 60 kilometers at maximum penetration before collapsing. The fuel shortage that Bayerlein had warned about had proven decisive. German forces simply couldn't move far enough, fast enough, or sustain operations long enough to achieve objectives. American fuel abundance had enabled the defense and counteroffensive that destroyed German hopes. Bayerlein survived the war and wrote extensively about his experiences. In his memoirs and interviews, he consistently emphasized logistics as the decisive factor in German defeat. He noted that German forces won tactical engagements frequently. German tanks were often superior to American tanks. German tactics were often more sophisticated. But none of that mattered because Germans couldn't sustain operations while Americans could. The side that can sustain operations wins. Everything else is theater. In a 1956 interview, Bayerlein was asked about the moment he knew Germany had lost. His response has become famous among military historians. December 22, 1944, when I read a report that Americans were burning more fuel in one day for heat than my entire division had for a month of combat operations. At that moment, I understood completely that we were not fighting an army. We were fighting an economy. And you cannot defeat the American economy with tanks and tactics. You can only delay the inevitable. We delayed for 5 more months, but the outcome was decided that day when I realized Americans could afford to waste what we desperately needed. The lesson Bayerlein drew was simple. In modern warfare between industrial powers, logistics determine outcomes more than tactics or equipment. The side with overwhelming logistics can afford to make tactical mistakes, use inferior equipment, and still win through material superiority. Germany made fewer tactical mistakes, often had superior equipment, and still lost because American logistics were so superior that other factors became secondary. This wasn't the lesson German military tradition wanted to learn, but it was the lesson American victory taught. The American perspective on this logistics advantage is revealing. American commanders rarely thought about fuel shortages. They assumed fuel would be available, and it always was. This assumption freed them to focus on operations rather than logistics. Patton's famous rapid advances were possible not because Patton was brilliant, but because American logistics kept his tanks fueled. When logistics couldn't keep up, even Patton stopped. But American logistics were so robust that keeping up was usually possible.
German commanders spent enormous mental energy on logistics planning that American commanders devoted to operational planning. This was advantage that compounded over time. Modern American military doctrine still reflects lessons learned from World War II logistics. The Pentagon maintains strategic petroleum reserves. Military logistics emphasize building large stockpiles before operations. Supply chains are designed with multiple redundancies. The goal is ensuring units never short of anything. This sometimes looks wasteful in peacetime. In wartime, it means American forces can operate knowing supplies will always be available. This knowledge is a psychological advantage as important as material advantage. The story of Generalmajor Fritz Bayerlein watching Americans waste fuel has become shorthand for the logistics disparity that defined World War II. One side conserving desperately, one side spending freely, one side calculating every liter, one side never calculating because supplies were unlimited. This wasn't American superiority in courage or skill. This was American superiority in production and logistics. Industrial capacity converted into battlefield capability, the arsenal of democracy made manifest as an army that never ran out of anything, while enemies ran out of everything. The German commander saw Americans waste more fuel in one day than his army had for a month of combat operations. In that observation was complete understanding of why Germany lost. Not lost this battle, lost the war. Lost because logistics matter more than tactics. Lost because abundance defeats scarcity. Lost because America's greatest weapon wasn't tanks or planes or ships. America's greatest weapon was the ability to produce so much of everything that waste became irrelevant. And against that weapon, there was no defense, only inevitable defeat, delayed by tactics and courage, but ultimately determined by simple mathematics of resources. The Americans could afford to be wasteful. The Germans couldn't afford to be efficient. When wastefulness beats efficiency, the war is already over. Bayerlein understood this on December 22, 1944. Germany took 5 more months to admit it officially. But the outcome was decided that day when American logistics proved capable of sustaining operations through pure abundance, while German logistics collapsed under absolute scarcity.